Hey folks, welcome to ScholarBot Tarot. Just call me Mayfield, and thanks a ton for stopping by my study space. The following is a presentation I gave at the Pop Culture Association virtual conference in June 2021 in the African American Studies area. I wanted to present it here on YouTube in its entirety. I do want to address that as a conference presentation, it's still fairly an unfinished project, but this was what I had at the time of presenting, with a few little extras. This is Black Magic, African American Public Memory in Contemporary Tarot. In this presentation, we'll introduce some of the basics of tarot, discuss a bit about where tarot's at in our current spiritual and political climates, and take an in-depth look at 3 different tarot projects over the last few years. So, let's get started. For those not in the know, tarot is a type of cartomancy, or card magic, made up of 78 cards. 22 major arcana depicting the Fool's Journey, and the minor arcana of 4 suits, 56 cards. Take out the majors and pages, you've got your standard playing cards. We'll also discuss Lenormand, another form of cartomancy. Get rid of the cards 2 to 5 in each suit. There you go. You have a Lenormand deck for fortune telling. Although that brings up a very important question. What is tarot used for? At this point, I think it's useful to pose tarot as a form of technology. According to Dr. Hong-An Wu, tarot as a technology involves the tarot practitioner engaging in a set of procedures that combines the cards, their positions, and their relation to each other to generate meaning. In other words, it's what you make of it and largely depends on what the reader is interested in. People use tarot for play, for fortune telling, for self-care, for writing, to collect, and as Wu elaborates, to simulate social justice. She goes on to explain, the adoption, appropriation, and adaptation of tarot and other delegitimized technologies by and for marginalized communities to cultivate imaginations informed by ancestral wisdoms demonstrate the resilience and resourcefulness of social activism. Use of the technologies we have available to us in innovative ways to make the world we need. And this is especially true in contemporary tarot. In a 2019 article, The Rise of Progressive Occultism by Tara Isabella Burton, Burton discusses progressive occultism as a political and spiritual statement of identity, as a cosmic counterbalance to Trumpian evangelicalism. And while I certainly don't doubt that the last 4 years of the 2010s led people away from Christian structures, it would be irresponsible to assume pagan spaces are inherently safe spaces for marginalized communities. In a 2017 article, Ethnic Neo-Pagan Altars and Ancestors in Texas, Dr. Brett Firth identifies an ethno-religious strategy to rework European ancestry within the context of white identity. I know that's a mouthful, but the practitioners of Celtic and other ethno-European traditions use this term blood memory, a term that might raise a red flag for you, that led them to returning to pagan practices, an attempt for white pagans to reclaim their whiteness without the stigma of racist overtones that it comes with. But it doesn't work like that, since the call of blood memory attempts to paradoxically erase and reconstruct a white ethnicity. Because yes, whiteness is not just the absence of color, it too is a social structure, and part of the privilege of whiteness is a claim to invisibility, or the default. And hey, if you don't subscribe to the concept of blood memory, perhaps you've heard or even agreed with the following arguments from some parts of the tarot community. What if there's no market for non-diverse decks? Should artists who don't provide diversity just not put their work out there? There are no people of color in insert historical era. And my favorite bad faith argument, what about insert another underrepresented group in a shameless effort to pit people against each other? I won't address every single one of those what ifs, all or nothings, and other slippery slopes, but all of this to say that the demand of diversity in tarot is absolutely warranted and needed for practitioners in general, though practitioners of color, particularly African American, not to craft some semblance of blood memory that reconstructs an ethnicity that simply isn't necessary for us, but to maintain the public memory of mere existence in America. More specifically, there's a demand to unearth what was lost through the African diaspora, in which colonialism violently interrupted the growth of African culture. A few tarot decks I wanted to put into the spotlight are those created by African American artists: the II Onyx Tarot by Courtney Alexander, the Black Gold Lenormand by T and Ian from Grandma Baby Apothecary, and the 2020 Visions Tarot by Krystal Banner. These three works offer special caveats in the larger theme of providing the public memory of African traditional religion through themes of double consciousness, sociological haunting, and the case against revisionist history making as we are living through now. So, what's at stake here? And why does this actually matter? Well, I won't go so far as to say that representation innately leads to liberation, but I truly believe that diversity within cartomancy, particularly the decks created by marginalized and underrepresented communities, offer an incredibly valuable product: public memory. From an article posted for free on Oxford, the term public memory refers to the circulation of recollections among members of a given community. History is always in the making and remaking, depending on who tells it and how we tell it. This is all considering that every once in a while, you'll see a canceled campaign for a deck that tried to capitalize on someone else's racially charged murder. Sometimes you'll see the well-intentions of a Ten of Swords inadvertently auctioned off for hundreds of dollars, which, that sentence alone leaves a bad taste in my mouth. At its worst, some artists will want to keep the history of minstrelsy alive through harmful stereotypes in the guise of an oracle deck. There's a bit more to each of these stories, but I'm far more interested in centering the works that give us the world that simulate a reality showing underrepresented groups merely existing, as opposed to homogeneous places that never existed to begin with. Beginning with the II Onyx Tarot by Courtney Alexander, it was launched in Kickstarter in September 2016, raising almost $30,000 for the first edition. The deck is currently on its second edition with a travel-sized edition, which is the one I currently own. As I've mentioned on this channel before, the II Onyx was the first tarot deck that made me think of tarot as a primary text that can be analyzed as such. And once that light bulb went off, Alexander reminded me of many secondary sources that would go with it. Alexander intended for this deck to encapsulate the Black experience, and in my readings of the cards, it's more complex than that. She portrayed near perfectly W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness. Double consciousness, as told by Du Bois, is this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. It's basically that contradiction of the African and American in the term African American. A specific and more nuanced example of this, and what inspired me to do this project in the first place, was my experience reading Dr. Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother. Hartman recounts her research trip along the transatlantic slave trade in efforts to locate memories of those who were enslaved. Unfortunately, she finds that the communities there further stigmatize the enslaved people, while simultaneously welcoming African Americans for their tourism dollars. Such a dehumanizing epiphany shows those fractures caused by societies with which they live in that they don't see their citizens in and of themselves. Those fragments that Alexander picked up and formed the whole picture. Out of this text, I found the court cards to be the most fascinating, as Alexander merged historical figures with African American celebrities to represent a particular court card. The ones you see here even have the added feature of referencing lore from African traditional religion, which if it wasn't for these cards, I would have never known. For our next deck, we have the Black Gold Lenormand, which was also funded on Kickstarter, launched on May 7th, 2020, and it raised over $44,000 for the first printing. The deck depicts early 20th century photos from the South. These public domain images are laced in gold foil, blurring the lines between the sacred and the mundane, as a mediation between the ancestors and the reader. Mediation describes the process that links an institution and an individual, a social structure and a subject, and history and a biography. In haunting, organized forces and systemic structures that appear removed from us make their impact felt in everyday life in a way that confounds our analytical separations and confounds the social separations themselves. These photos of people I don't know feel so familiar to me, and yet they also represent a specific era, the Jim Crow South. These are African Americans living in the fallout of the failed Reconstruction era, living normal lives, whatever normal was to them, and I can't untangle their personhood from the larger structure of systemic racism that they endured within these pictures. Here on the screen are some of my favorites. T and Ian did a wonderful job in simultaneously decolonializing some of the traditional meanings of the Lenormand cards, while bringing the intimacy of African American ancestry to the forefront. The Lily card in particular is traditionally described to, quote-unquote, suffer from a bit of a Madonna whore complex, according to the Labyrinthos website, but here we see a regular young woman doing some shopping. In the guidebook, T and Ian completely subvert this narrative, explaining, prioritizing pleasure is revolution. After generations of sacrifice and policing of Black bodies, Black culture, and Black joy. Such a striking declaration of empowerment further blurs those lines between the sacred and the mundane, that to prioritize pleasure are both actually. Finally, we have the 2020 Visions by Krystal Banner, launched in June 2020. It raised $15,000, and Banner completed the Major Arcana on September 15th, 2020. Despite the disaster year not to its full completion, Banner wanted to provide an archive of events that inspired her art. More interestingly, her deck solidifies itself as a text for and against methods of public memory making. The best example is the Devil card here. My experience with this card completely took my breath away when the feeling of surreal disbelief sunk in, prompting me to wonder, did we really have such a deplorable person in the White House? I know people who religiously supported him that are now quietly kicking their red hats under the rug. Did that actually happen? I ask myself. I cannot believe last year actually happened. To be quite honest, I, as many of us, are beginning to forget as revisionist media whitewashes the January 6th Capitol riots, even as it was happening, and more details became clearer. I'm also acknowledging out loud how dangerous it is to forget about these events. It's happened before, and it can indeed happen again if we don't remain vigilant, or at the very least educated. History is a living, breathing project that you're always a part of, whether you want to be or not. The 2020 Visions is a good illustration to remind us of how politically ingrained we are in seemingly politicless things, tarot and spirituality included. And I want to emphasize that point. We know that established religion can be politicized. Spirituality and the tools made for that practice, tarot included, are not immune to that politicization. Even the claim that tarot is not or should not be political is inherently a political statement that render the realities of the world invisible, not unlike the blood memory concept we were introduced earlier. In conclusion, I hope this quick overview was helpful in understanding the significance of African American artists' work in tarot. It's important to see diversity within a deck. The public memory and representation of the Black experience within these texts carry a weight of cultural, historical, and spiritual significance for readers of color and any readers who wish to see the world as it is through different perspectives. Diversity is the memory of the world that we live in, and tarot is the technology that simulate the world that we want to see in the future. Once again, thanks a ton for joining me at my study space. Definitely like, comment, and subscribe. As per usual, be sure to make discourse and not war. So if you have any questions, if you have like your 2 cents that you want to add into the comment, just remember to be civil and I will get to them in order that I see them. I really look forward to hearing some thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, this project is kind of unfinished. I mean, you saw how quickly we blew through like each segment, and I could easily make a single video about each of the decks that I explored today, and hey, maybe I will. So if there's anything in particular that you want me to expand on, definitely request that in the comments, and I'll see what I can do sometime in the future. It is just the beginning of the year, and I have plenty of video essays that I would love to do. So just let me know, and until next time, bye!